So first we have with us Aaron Baird. He is the the director of communications policy communications at Protect Democracy, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit whose mission is exactly what it sounds like, to protect democracy and prevent authoritarianism in the U.S. So he's going to talk about a research paper, which you all have in front of you that they did, as well as other research that they've been doing, and how that applies to what we do as journalists. As you all know, Biden spoke on this just a couple weeks ago. Margaret Sullivan made threats to democracy the subject of her last column for the Washington Post. I mean, this is one of those things that is coming up, continuing to come up, and it may very well be that the next two elections that you all cover are, the most significant of your career. So with that, let's welcome Aaron, and we'll kick off the day.
I'll say we've got a lot of cultural approaches at Protect Democracy, and so in the spirit of getting more honest, I'll share with you a few things about my state of mind. First, I'm a new dad for the third time, so my sleep bucket is decidedly less than full. And second, I've been presented in person for 2.5 years, so if I'm a little rusty, please bear with me. So as Ann mentioned, or maybe didn't mention, I had a stint working in news media. I was in a media startup, Quartz, before I came to Protect Democracy, before it was sold and sold again and pivoted to a different kind of news. But I know this is uncharted territory for many of us. And journalists' job to both cover what's happening, but also provide the context and make sense of it is hard enough, especially as the land is shifting under everyone's feet. So I just want to start off by saying genuinely, thank you for doing this. Your work is critical to making democracy healthier and sustainable because, without a clear understanding of the crisis we're living through, citizens can't engage in their communities and in their countries in ways that counter this authoritarian threat. And without journalism that provides and explains that context clearly and consistently, the public's left to figure out complex events and dynamics on their own. I also want to acknowledge that, as Ann mentioned, and as you know, we've published this resource on the Playbook at a time when there's a lively debate happening about how the news media should handle politics coverage. Former Washington Post columnist and New York Times public editor who's now going to do democracy-specific work, I think down at Duke School of Journalism, Margaret Sullivan, last year called for a total rethinking of how the media should approach this moment. John Carl, the well-respected Washington correspondent for ABC News, got a lot of attention last year when he admitted that ABC News was struggling with how to do their jobs when you have anti-democratic candidates running for office, including for president. And many others have been increasingly open about the fact that faced with the deluge of, distraction that is flooding the zone, some newsrooms are struggling to figure out what's a real threat to democracy, what isn't, and what journalists should do about it. Of course, these aren't easy questions, and as we'll talk more about, it's partially because today's slide into authoritarianism is a process that happens slowly and piecemeal. At a micro level, it can be really hard to distinguish authoritarian tactics from what we might consider unsavory politics, but politics that are acceptable in a democracy. And so today, I'd like to walk through a framework that we came up with for identifying authoritarian threats that can be tricky to see playing out in real time. I'd also like to offer up humbly and with humility some suggestions for coverage that may help your audiences appreciate the difference between real threats and everyday politics. Of course, this is all reinforced in our report, and I brought each of you a copy, as you see, and I can grab one for you if you missed it, but hopefully it can be a useful resource. So I'm going to go ahead and give a presentation on the playbook and our framework. Then we can talk through this stuff because it can be tricky. We'll do some Q&A, and then we'll take a break and come back and do a fun little practical exercise. Okay, let me jump in. To put it simply, democracy is in the world is in recession and has been for some time. When we look around the world, the quality of democracy has been declining for at least 15 years, and democracies that have long considered themselves stable or that have long been considered stable have found themselves backsliding into risky territory. While other countries who are newer to democracy are changing in ways that make it hard to keep calling them democratic at all. Of course, you're smart, informed people, and you may be familiar with the general story here, but it's worth revisiting some of the data to drive the scale of the problem home. So as you know, there are 3 major indices around the world that study and track the spread of democracy. In the US, Freedom House has been doing tracking since the 1940s or so. That's where this data comes from. As you can see here, up until about 2007, the percentage of countries in the world that were democracies was growing. But since 2007, that percentage has been shrinking. I mentioned the 3 indices because we're seeing this democracy recession via multiple measures, whether that's from this graph, drawing on Freedom House's measure of countries that are considered fully free, or if we use the second major index, which is the more comprehensive Varieties of Democracy Institute, based in Sweden, or VDEM, measure of liberal democracy. And it shows a similar plateauing and then a reversal in the modern era. If you look at that middle black line with the gray band, that's the total global population living under democratic government. And as you can see, it has gone off a cliff in the last 10 years. So you can see democracy is in trouble. It's not limited to any particular geographic region. It's global. The other major index is the Economist Intelligence Unit, which since around, I think, 2006 has been putting out an annual democracy index score, and which in the last 3 years has fallen to its lowest point since they started. Now you might look at these figures and think, it doesn't all look bad. Sure, we're not seeing much expansion of democracy around the world, but maybe we're just stagnating before more countries get back on track, building full liberal democracies. Unfortunately, we think that's a misreading of the situation. Maybe it's not your reading, but some folks might argue that. But as I mentioned, as I'll talk about in a little while, and this is a really critical point, democracies rarely collapse overnight these days. It takes time and it happens gradually. So to get the full picture, you really need to look at the trends. And the trends are not good. The figure shows in blue the percentage of the world's population living in countries that are becoming more democratic over time. And in red, it shows the percentage of the global population living in countries that are becoming more authoritarian. Thanks especially to big, highly populated countries like India, Brazil, and the United States, a higher percentage of people today are living in countries that are becoming more authoritarian than at the height of the Cold War in the 1980s. I think there's a generally held nice idea that the story of the last 75 years of global history is a story of increasing freedom around the world. But unfortunately, as you can see, that's not the case. Of course, as we now know well, democracy in the United States is also at risk. The same experts who have studied and tracked the decline of democracy globally for decades are raising alarms about its health in the United States. Again, data from Freedom House tracks the beginning of the U.S.'s downward trend to approximately 2010. And in case that wasn't clear, that predates former President Trump. So this has been going on in the U.S. for over a decade. As you can see, over the course of that decade, the U.S. has been right there among the most quickly declining democracies in the world. This map shows countries that have seen the biggest drop in their democracy scores, according to VDEM. The darker the red, the bigger the drop. Only a few countries like India, Turkey, Hungary, and Brazil have fared worse than the U.S. over the same time. Trends in American opinion aren't great either. In the last 30 years, the percentage of Americans who are open to the idea of military rule has about tripled. Obviously, that's still far from a majority, but that is not a good trend line. And it's largely, believe it or not, being driven by younger Americans. So if you ask Americans the question, to what degree do they believe it is essential to live in a democracy, older Americans overwhelmingly think the answer is yes, but younger Americans much less so. There are a bunch of theories about what that might be, but right now the attitude towards democracy among younger Americans is weaker than attitudes towards democracy in Poland were prior to the rise of Law and Justice, the right-wing populists and Liberal Party in Poland. You may all have also seen recent polling that 69% of Americans believe that our democracy is at risk of collapse. That's remarkable because that 69% is reflective of both Democrats and Republicans. The good news is that Americans recognize that our system is in trouble. The bigger bad news is that your partisan preference really determines exactly what you think the trouble is. If you're a Republican, you blame the current president and his party. If you're a Democrat, you blame the former president and his party. My colleague who's got a PhD in this stuff tells me that over the last few years, political science research has made it clear that the average person has a really hard time disentangling democratic values, other policy preferences, and bipartisanship, and partisanship. Basically, it's hard to figure out whether your policy preferences align with democracy, and when people have to choose between holding up core democratic principles and supporting candidates or policies that they prefer, they don't always choose democracy. Shocking. And as you can imagine, people will even change and twist how they define democracy to convince themselves that they aren't actually making a choice between the two. So that's dangerous. When democracy itself becomes viewed as a purely political or partisan issue, it's not hard to imagine how people will respond. This is why the current authoritarian threat is so effective and so dangerous. What you're getting as a result of these trend lines is this wave of autocrats around the world in the 21st century. And so what do these people and their movement do when they come to power? Well, when we founded Protect Democracy, we asked kind of a body of the leading comparative political scientists that question back in early 2017. And we said, hey, is there a pattern that you can make out from all these different examples around the world that might serve as a kind of warning to us in the US of what it might look like if we were following down this global path? And they said, absolutely. There is a pattern in all these countries that looks remarkably similar, regardless of whether the people leading it are very deliberate and strategic and Machiavellian in the way that a Putin or Orban might be, or whether they're almost kind of bumbling and accidental in a way that Maduro or Trump might be. They end up doing the same things because fundamentally these leaders believe they are the only legitimate font of power and that any check on that power is illegitimate, and they steamroll those checks. Again, we've gotten used to thinking about democracies falling apart in a dramatic and obvious way, something that would land on the front page of whatever newspaper that you may write for. Maybe you'd have a military coup or a massive violent uprising. But as I've mentioned, for at least the last 30 years, that's usually not how it works. Today, we watch democracies erode. Authoritarianism wears democracy down, little piece by little piece. None of these little pieces on their own obviously look like a complete breakdown, and many of those little pieces taken together, taken alone actually, without the context and the ability to connect the dots, just look like tough, competitive, hard-nosed politics. So this is where the media role is vital. When democracy is on the decline, we all have an intuitive sense that something is wrong, but understanding what the real threats are and separating them out from the horse race, the jockeying, the spin, and the partisan politics as usual, that's the really hard part. And that's where you all can make a difference. We all need you to be able to separate the real authoritarian threats from the political noise. That's exactly why my colleagues and I produced this report on the Authoritarian Playbook. In a nutshell, we've covered the 7 most common tactics that would-be authoritarians use to consolidate power. We also share a framework for how to distinguish real threats from typical jockeying, and we've got a flowchart. You got to have a flowchart. And again, this is and was intended to be a synthesis of the leading research on democratic backsliding from around the world. I co-wrote this with my colleague who led, the democracy program at Georgetown for years. We went out and asked a bunch of the leading experts on this stuff for their input. You'll see some quotes sprinkled throughout. It's a summary, and it's a resource for journalists that's coming from the experts. These are the 7 tactics. I'm going to walk through them one by one, but from the outset, keep in mind that the 7 tactics we covered don't happen in isolation. They are dynamic, and they interact, and they build on each other. I'm going to keep harping on the point that being able to recognize the whole landscape is really important. So first up, would-be authoritarians politicize independent institutions, and specifically, they try to politicize institutions that are designed to be independent or nonpartisan and nonpartisan and need independence to be able to function. Things like law enforcement or central banking or even election administration. We see this around the world when Argentina's president fires the head of the National Statistics Agency in favor of a political ally to try and hide inflation numbers, or when Viktor Orban fills Hungary's bureaucracy with political allies. And here in the US, we've seen folks work to undermine the credibility of the deep state, the Department of Justice, and we're watching it play out right now with election administrators. Would-be authoritarians do this because it gives them more room to move without constraints and to consolidate their own power. Now I packed 4 into the next slide because I think these are probably the most well-known. Would-be authoritarians spread disinformation, and they do it in a deliberate, brazen, fire hose of falsehoods kind of way. They want to undermine the very idea that facts matter. They aggrandize executive power, and they weaken checks and balances. To them, the executive is the only legitimate power, and so checks and balances are something to be dismantled, not respected. Would-be authoritarians also quash dissent. They curtail the freedom of the press, civil society, and of course peaceful protest. And they punish any whistleblowing that comes from within the system. Would-be authoritarians also target vulnerable communities as a tactic. They often try to rally some majority around made-up threats and position themselves as working on behalf of the real people who are more legitimate. Would-be authoritarians corrupt elections. But importantly, and this is really a modern-day autocratic pro tip, if you're an aspiring authoritarian, you've got to keep elections around in some way so it looks like you've got some legitimacy. But just make sure those elections are neither free nor fair. Corrupted elections are one of the biggest threats we're facing in the US today, as you guys know. And there are proposals in a number of states that, if adopted, would allow partisan legislatures to subvert and, in some cases, even overturn election results in the future. And finally, would-be authoritarians stoke violence. Sometimes this is used as a way to support other tactics in the playbook. Quashing dissent, for example, can become violent. But violence has its own impact as well. It's designed to spread a feeling of insecurity that primes people for the kind of strongman rule that would-be authoritarians claim to be selling. So these 7 tactics together make up the authoritarian playbook. They look different from one country to another, but overwhelmingly authoritarian-leaning leaders will use at least some of them. Of course, in isolation, these tactics are problematic. But taken together, they can erode democracy one piece at a time. And we've seen that the farther down the road that a country gets, the harder it is to turn around. So how can you all help to keep the public informed about this process when it's happening in real time? One really dangerous piece of this authoritarian playbook is that we can all be lulled into a false sense of security when any one event can be explained away. And I think this is a really critical point, because in the moment any one event can be explained away, and people get paid a lot of money to try to try and explain away events. People are good at this. But if the media covers it that way, without connecting the dots, it can keep the public from fully understanding what's happening. And it risks desensitizing us to the very things we need to be most sensitive to keep our democracy healthy. So when it comes to threats to democracy, we're pushing this idea that coverage should be unbiased, but not neutral. And what do I mean by that? Well, bias would be filtering coverage through a personal, ideological, or personal lens, or partisan lens. It would give readers only the facts that support one narrative and ignore everything else. Nobody wants that. Well, we don't want that, and you don't want that. But being unbiased doesn't mean that coverage can't apply a consistent standard. Being unbiased doesn't mean don't take context into account. And it doesn't mean don't draw conclusions about what's happening. What we're saying is really quite simple, that if it looks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. It's not biased to say that a duck is a duck. Okay. But not every bird is a duck. And as much as some might not like to admit it, not every unsavory or contentious political event is a 5-alarm threat to democracy. You've got to be judicious. So it's hard, but it's crucial for you all, for the news media, for the Fourth Estate, to be able to clearly distinguish between the food fights and the real threats to democracy so that you can credibly help us all understand those differences. Now let me share the 3 lessons that we've learned that can hopefully help determine whether we've got a real threat on our hands. The first lesson that we've learned is you've got to know the 7 tactics in the playbook. So boom, you can check that box. Recognizing when an actor or set of actors are drawing on tactics in the playbook can help the media know when and how to sound the alarm, but also when not to. Here's the real trick. Because modern authoritarians tend to use all or most of these, whether they have a pattern of following other tactics in the playbook is probably the most important litmus test of whether the event or action is normal political jockeying or not. So if you see an action that looks like one of the 7 tactics, look around, see if the playbook tactics are also, other playbook tactics are also being used. Often if you have an aspiring authoritarian, these tactics aren't being used in isolation. If you see one, you'll likely see others. And more often than not, even just one event will probably involve multiple tactics from the playbook. For example, if you see one incident of disinformation spreading, take a closer look. If that's really all that's happening, if that's really an isolated incident, it's probably not or should be covered as a true authoritarian threat. But if it's coupled with, for example, quashing dissent or stoking violence, it could be a threat. And the next two lessons will help us figure that out. So let's say you've identified authoritarian tactics in the real world. Is it a true threat to democracy? An important question to answer is the extent of deviation from precedent. Is this new? The further something is from past prior practice, the greater risk it might be a sign of something dangerous. But two caveats are important because journalists shouldn't take claims of precedent or something being normal at face value. Why? Because first, not all precedent is good precedent. We have in the United States, for example, a dark history of racist measures like poll taxes that provide plenty of precedent for restricting access to the ballot. If we went back to that precedent, that would shift the status quo towards authoritarianism in pretty obvious ways. So you need a little common sense here when applying the precedent test. But another thing to look at is the degree or frequency. And if norm breaking is happening a lot, if the tactics are being used frequently, that is also a sign of an increased risk. Because a relatively isolated incident doesn't necessarily mean democracy is eroding. But if you're seeing some of the 7 tactics over and over again, particularly when they might lead to the establishment of a new bad precedent going forward, it starts to look more like an authoritarian threat. Another way to think about this is to look at an example that we wouldn't characterize as an authoritarian threat today, which is gerrymandering. Probably not great for democracy. But most of the time it's employed, it's not using multiple tactics from the playbook. And it's been practiced by both parties for a long time. So unfortunately, there's a lot of precedent for it in American politics. And so using this framework, at least, we wouldn't suggest it justifies the kind of urgent coverage as when covering the tools in the playbook. But with big or frequent deviations from precedent, it's much more likely that the only story that really matters, is the authoritarian threat. So now you've spotted the tactics, you've decided this is new and significant and dangerous. How serious is the threat? Are we in a really bad place? The last lesson we've learned is to look at whether the authoritarian risk to democracy is systemic. So for example, looking at, does this serve to consolidate power? Is an individual acting alone? How do their allies respond? Is the system, which is typically, or especially the individual's political party, responding to constrain the actor? And we've learned to ask this because the experts know that authoritarian moves that are supported by institutions or political parties, as you can see from this quote from Sherry Berman, expert on this stuff, or other well-established organizations, those are much bigger threats than moves taken by individual actors alone. For example, Donald Trump's ongoing efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. While Trump's individual efforts to undermine the election were dangerous in and of themselves and checked a lot of the boxes we're talking about, the large number of Republican members of Congress who voted against certifying the election, many of whom are now running on the lie that it was stolen, represent an even more severe risk. So we know and we get that there are tons of demand on coverage, from partisan fairness to accuracy to what readers will actually read. But again, the problem with modern authoritarianism is that it is often murky at the micro level, and working out sort of these big picture frameworks beforehand can help guide those micro decisions and make sure that the result is rigorous, fact-based coverage that is firmly unbiased, but decidedly not neutral between authoritarianism and democracy. So if I can leave you with just 3 things from all that I've covered here. 1, contemporary authoritarianism doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow, piecemeal process that involves a range of tactics. 2, identifying and explaining genuine authoritarian threats depends heavily on context. An event that might not be noteworthy in one situation might be fatal to democracy in another. 3rd, the media is and should be the vital institution helping the public to understand that context and the stakes of these events. So the bottom line is that the public needs context and judicious coverage so they can recognize the story before it's too late. And with that, I'll say thanks for having me. Good luck. And I'll pass the mic back to Anne, or we could also just open this up to discussion and try to talk some of the stuff through or try to answer any questions folks have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. One question that I have is there's a lot of focus on, my name is Jimena Bustillo and I'm with NPR. Sorry, you literally just told me to do that.
Wait, tell me your name one more time.
Jimena Bustillo with
Good
NPR. There's a lot of focus on the political actors themselves and trends with them. But like particularly when looking at United States democracy, because there's still a solid voting system, there are threats to that, but there's a method and there's a system. At what point do we look at voters and voting trends, or why a voter might elect an authoritarian, or if Donald Trump runs again and he does well, at what point do we look at the voters versus what just the political actor is doing?
I think trying to figure out why all this stuff is happening is a very important endeavor. There are a lot of theories about what's happening here, and we didn't get into those. But it's really a kind of like grab bag of things, and I think there are demographic reasons, there are economic reasons, there are technological shifts that are putting a lot of people at unease, and this is happening around the world. So there's a bunch of research about popular opinions and why we're in this state, why we found ourselves in this state. I think interesting to us, there's this idea that, and there's sort of a through line since the financial crisis in the early 2000s, of this lack of accountability and the lack of government being perceived as working for anybody. We've done a lot of research about how accountability is necessary around the world, especially if you're talking about prosecuting a former chief executive or head of state. Folks are encouraged when they see that actions have repercussions, that the standard applied to them also applies to the folks that they've elected to represent them. And so I think that there are a lot of things happening that explains the discontent, that explains the being softening the ground for something new, something that's working. I think covering those factors is equally as important as covering the thing happening in the world, and is critically important context when you talk about when these things are happening in the world. You can say X, Y, and Z has this to say about why this is happening, or A, B, and C did research on this, and that sort of is one factor in thinking about this stuff. So I think context, it's certainly important. I don't think there's a right answer. I think there are a lot of right answers, and I think the more that folks understand this, the more they're armed to sort of counter these threats. Ben.
Can you just talk about the challenge of fitting the former president into this sort of rubric? Because just by nature of covering politics now and listening to how both sides sort of respond and react to things, it's not hard to see people on the right or some of the president's defenders saying, well, some of the things that have been done to the former president fall into these categories, and actually that's authoritarianism. So I'm just curious, does that present a unique challenge to us, and how would you suggest go about addressing that if he is sort of an unprecedented figure and acts in an unprecedented way that maybe other people, other leaders have not, who you would try to fit into these sort of indices?
Totally. I think there maybe is a two-part answer to that question. One is, let's think about it in context of the framework that I just talked about. So does he present a real authoritarian threat based on these three lessons that we came up with? Well, he certainly deployed a lot of the tactics that experts would define as authoritarian tactics at multiple times, as you said, unprecedented in many ways. So it has significantly deviated from prior practice in many ways. And in talking about some of those examples, particularly like in aggrandizing executive power, I mean, there's the, now we know, first of all, the use of acting appointments, the abuse of the pardon power, the undermining of the bureaucracy, putting in political allies in place of longstanding experts. And, we're talking about Schedule F coming back in 2024. That's exactly what they do, what Orban has done. You get rid of bureaucracy, you put in hacks in place to make it more pliant to what you want to do. So if you look at that first lesson, check. I think if you look at the second lesson, it certainly checks the boxes. And as you mentioned, how has the system responded? How have his allies responded? How has his party responded? And when you think about the systemic risk, that he presents, I think that we would view it as a very grave danger. I think the second part of that question is, what can we do about it, or what do is that more of like what can journalists do about it, or what we think can be done?
No, I guess I'm wondering. That's not so much what I was trying to ask as much as, have the models in these questions, have you had to adjust these based on the last couple of years? And, for example, acting appointments aren't necessarily new, and putting political allies in places aren't new, but as you note, some of the frequency and the regularity of some of these actions may check another box. Right. Is this something that, I guess this framework isn't, I guess my question is this sort of a static framework, or do you see this changing based on, what we've seen the last couple of years and after the election?
Totally. So I think what we tried to do is first, it's a nonpartisan standard. Past presidents, Democrats have engaged in a lot of this stuff, and that's actually, we went around and did a bunch of briefings in newsrooms on some of these, some of the big picture. Why is this happening? Where are we going from here? What are the threats to look out for? And this playbook was born out of that question. LBJ dabbled in misinformation. The executive expanded under Obama. How can you tell? How can you tell when there's a real, true authoritarian threat and when it's hard-nosed politics? And so I'll just say, this is we tried to apply a fairly consistent standards across both parties. And so I would say that this is a standard that can apply and can apply going forward. It's based, like I said, in decades of comparative political science on this stuff. But I think it is helpful to have that framework because, as you said, some of these acts can be explained away, but when you see a pattern of abuse and when you see a pattern of using the tactics and you see 2 or 3 used together in the same event, that enables you to check that box and move on to the second lesson and third lesson and check those things. So I think it's helpful. I think this is what is designed to do, and I think that we can say, comfortably using this framework, we can apply it to other countries and say, we see this as a severe danger. And obviously, the bright side of that is that the U.S. is one of the only countries that had an autocrat elected in office and pushed him out through fairly normal means. And so I think we did it here, and does that change the context of the framework? I think the framework still applies and will apply going forward. To kind of answer your question?
Yeah, yes.
It's hard.
Hi, Joseph from Insider, and thank you for talking.
Hi, Joseph.
So I was pretty surprised by that stat that 1 in 4 young Americans are less committed to democracy. So how are we supposed to operate in that environment without crossing into outright advocacy? Because, for example, like most European news organizations, like I'm thinking of Le Monde in France, El País in Spain, they're more comfortable operating in that lane, but most American newsrooms are still very allergic to that.
So the first part of the question is, given the trend line towards not valuing democracy in younger people, how can you approach as a journalist? How can you reverse that trend line, or how can you contribute to giving them the facts?
These are like these are basically like the future news readers, like the future consumers of news, and it feels pretty surprising that trust in democracy among them is pretty low.
Totally. I think a couple of things are probably happening in that case, and it's a really good question. So like I said, we're seeing sort of a conflation of democracy and personal policy preferences. If you look at recent research, if you ask people, do they support democratic principles, they the majority of them will say, yes, indeed, we value it, we support it. When you ask them how that is, for example, climate change and democracy issue, is abortion a democracy issue? People are very comfortable assigning their political point of view a democracy frame. And so I think I think the way that I would answer this, and obviously you guys know this better than me, and I would defer to you a little bit about like your approach in the newsroom about best ways to approach the facts. But I think like the more information folks have, the more context of why this stuff is happening is helpful. Again, your job is not to be political messengers, and we don't want you to be. And so I think like your job, in my view, is to not spin democracy issues when you see them. And so let me talk about an example with the January 6th committee work that I think that speaks to this. And it probably can apply to younger Americans as it can to this group of voters, which we've done some research on. I think there's a tendency, and I do this, to think of partisan blocks as like big and monolithic. You've got X 80 million voters who feel one way, you've got 74 million voters who feel the other way. When you get into the research and start to cut it up and slice it up, those are 74 million people. There are all kinds of opinions and values and perspectives that they have. It's not a monolithic block. And what you start to see that is when certain segments of that group, and this has been particularly true with the January 6th stuff, when they start to be exposed to facts, when they start to be exposed to a fact-based narrative about these threats to democracy, minds actually shift. It's not a huge amount, but it's big enough to move the needle. We're talking about like 10, 12 percentage points in certain groups. And so I think that the commitment to presenting a fact-based narrative rather than, the politics as usual, who's winning, who's losing, calling the threats as you see them, as I think the January 6th media coverage has done. It's been really interesting. A lot of those political food fights have fallen away, and when you had this trickle of information come out, you saw public polling move, and so we've been really encouraged by that. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Joseph.
Hi, Sophia
Sophia.
with Axios.
Good to meet you.
Good to meet you too. My question is, can you give us some examples of unbiased but not neutral reporting? Like, for instance, if you wanted to take Mastriano, Republican who's running for governor in PA, or Carrie Lake, like those are folks that we write often about or at least mention. I mean, is it enough to say, he is an election denier, he was in support of the plan to decertify the election and more? Like what more needs to be done? Like what do you see as unbiased but not neutral election when you cover these two?
I want to say that the work being done on this stuff has been excellent already. I think you guys are doing a very good job. And I think you have an incredibly hard job given, the fractured information ecosystem, given the amount of misinformation that's out there, given sort of the unprecedented nature and the, floor shifting beneath us. So I just want to say, this is really hard stuff. It's new stuff. This, I'll sort of say, like, that's why we're doing this work. That's why we try to put out resources like these that can be a helpful framework for thinking about this stuff. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but if you're providing the context, if you're covering the news from a fact-based framework, I think that's what you can do, and I think it makes a difference. Specifically specific journalistic tips, I think harder for us to make concrete recommendations. Although, if you see, we did try to put a kind of a one-pager on practical ways you can think about this stuff. And with the disinformation stuff specifically, I'll say it's been really encouraging to see. We've gone and done some of these briefings for platforms who are thinking about trying to combat these issues specifically, and they're really receptive. They really want to change this stuff. I think there are a bunch of organizations who are working on how to cover disinformation.
Do you mean like big tech?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, right.
I'm curious what their response was.
Open, and not open. I'm not being generous. Like asking the kind of questions that you guys are asking, hard questions about how can we make this better. And it's hard to say like, whoa, I don't know what your algorithm looks like. But there, we actually put together a one-pager on covering disinfo specifically, and it's not original stuff from us, but I can share that with you guys. There's some of that stuff in here. You want to cover it as a story, not just a Mastriano said this and somebody else said this. You want to find out like who's profiting from doing this stuff, because really it is quite a profitable business, and we've made it part of like one of our work streams to kind of like shut down those actors with litigators we have on staff. But you don't want to repeat it, stuff that don't put it in the headline. I think there are more specific tips that I can follow up with you about, but it is hard stuff.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Sure.
If I could just real quickly on that, probably most of you have already done this, but if you haven't, it's a good idea to, especially with certain types of candidates that do tend to put out a lot of mis and disinformation, to work with your editor on paragraphs of B matter. So you might have like a short one that goes near the top and then a longer one that goes near the bottom. That can really help put into context and for instance, I remember we had one for Trump that kind of outlined like this was brought to this many courts, and was found to be unfounded, and we had links to that coverage. So having that kind of backup and explanation can be really helpful, probably more so than just the label of election denier. So just something to keep in mind.
Thank you. Ashley.
Yes, Ashley
Hi.
Murray, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I had a question about the debate that happened. It was like a nearly all-night debate in the Senate. I can't remember which month, but it was around voting rights and the filibuster. And ultimately, it did not go anywhere because I think Manchin and Sinema did not want to change the filibuster rules. But you heard throughout the weeks leading up to that and this all-night session about threats to democracies at the state legislature level and changes in voting regulations on the state level. So I guess I'm curious where state legislatures fit into this argument, and then also discerning what is precedented and what is new here. I mean, I think state legislatures have, quite often done things that, were seemed extreme to one political party or the other. So can you talk about that?
Sort of does this stuff on the Senate floor matter if the states are taking actions that are undermining or going further? Is that sort of the question?
I guess I'm just I guess I'm wondering if we were seeing this language from Democrats about threats to democracy as like a political tool to get their legislation passed, or if there actually is threats to democracies from the state legislatures.
Very good question. So I think just as voters and citizens have a hard time disentangling democracy issues from their own political preferences, that's obviously in part due to politicians who are attempting to entangle them to political advantage. Are there real concerns that some of the voting rights legislation that I think you're referring to attempts to address? Absolutely. In some ways, though, that package predated some of the more recent threats and more acute threats that we've seen. And so I think, like, as an organization, we were, of course, supportive of that package. But there are things that we would have preferred to see in it that more acutely spoke to the moment that we're in. Some of those things are things like the Electoral Count Act reform, which we saw flare up at the end of the 2020 election. And actually measures that would put curbs on presidential abuse of power, sort of put up guardrails to prevent Trump 2.0, whoever comes in next. There's this idea that Trump was a bit of a bumbling would-be autocrat, and we're seeing, as you guys may know, folks joust for who's going to be that Trump 2.0, who's actually pretty savvy and knows how to use the levers of government. It might well be Trump himself if he gets reelected. As I said, we've seen coverage around the discussion of Schedule F being rolled out again in a 2024 candidacy. And so, are there threats to democracy that legislation might improve? I think yes. I think were there more targeted actions, other legislation that some which was added could have addressed. I think that's also true. I worked on the Hill for a couple of years, and you kind of take what you have sometimes and try to move the ball on that. But obviously, there's a lot of politics to this, and so the second part of your question about how does that relate to state legislatures? I think we've been at the forefront of the sounding alarms, starting at the beginning of the last year about the movement of state legislatures across, 15 to 20 different states. You've got several hundred different pieces of legislation that do everything from, impose more severe criminal penalties on election administrators for making what some might consider good faith mistakes, to ranging to putting in place mechanisms that could overturn the results of elections that one party didn't like. Those are very real, and we've put out several reports and updated reports on the specific legislation being passed at the state level, which I'd love to share with you all as well. We just put out an update about two to 3 weeks ago. So if you're Googling it, which is probably the fastest way to get it, I think it's Democracy Crisis in the Making. Definitely worth reading through. And so I would say yes. The interesting thing, and I think this speaks to Ben's point, when we think about a would-be authoritarian, we think about an individual typically, but this is really about a movement. And it gets to the third lesson that we discussed, the systemic constraints. Parties and the movement, I think, have taken up some of these authoritarian tactics. And so being cognizant of those tactics and applying this framework to the states, I think is super relevant.
And just a reminder, Amanda Zaro, who spoke to us a couple months ago, the voting rights tracker that she shared with us is also a good tool. I don't know that it would show the historical context, but it would certainly allow you to compare your state to other states in terms of the measures that have or haven't been taken or have been proposed. I would also, so I know a lot of you aren't covering the state house, but we have done separate state house fellowships. And just from those, I know one thing that always comes out that people find helpful is to make friends with your state house historian or librarian, because they are typically an underutilized resource. A lot of reporters kind of tend to forget about them, but they can be very helpful, especially if they've been around for a while, which many of them have, in terms of giving you that historical context of has this happened before.
One other thing I'll say, and I sort of spoke to this in the shaping up of the voting rights legislation. One thing you can do specifically, and this is in the playbooks in the section on corrupting elections, illustrate kind of the diverse ways that elections can be corrupted. Again, I think voting rights and the suppression of voting rights has been a real problem for a long time. It's become more relevant today, for many reasons. Maybe Matt can talk about a few of those reasons. I know he's down in Georgia now. But it's not just voter suppression. There's gerrymandering, which we talked about, biased electoral rules, the subversion stuff. I think explaining the differences between those things is super important for readers. Because as I think you mentioned, there was this big voting rights package. Doesn't it cover all the problems? And we're finding out, we're saying no, it didn't. It doesn't cover some of these specific problems that are are perhaps more, not more relevant, but are perhaps more acute is the right word today.
Mark Walker at the New York Times.
Hi, Mark.
Do you guys track sort of like authoritarian threats through like the legislature, like track different bills and efforts in different like states across the country down to like, well, it's like state or local or county level sort of like threats? And if not, like how would I go about sort of like digging into that and sort of trying to track sort of like to see if this is a growth that's going up? Where is it sort of like focused on? Like how would I go about doing something like that?
Great question. So a little bit about us. You know, we were founded beginning of 2017 as nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to preventing the decline of authoritarianism in the United States. So at the time, I think the A word was a little triggering for people. People said, you know, can that happen here? Is that the word we should be using? And I think over the time, unfortunately, we've seen it become much more of a mainstream accepted idea. And, you know, people can call authoritarianism a lot of different things. As Ben said, different parties use it in different ways and try to co-opt it. But we've expanded from like a group of 5, you know, former White House counsel and DOJ litigators to, unfortunately, and fortunately for us, a group of over 80 plus, you know, folks doing policy, litigation, advocacy, and sort of like media stuff and work like this. That means now we've got a bunch of folks down in the States, in certain states, I think 7 or 8 now. And so what I would say, you know, practically is we are tracking. We've got like dedicated people for each states that I would love to put you in touch with. There are a lot more kind of like specific trackers. I think just this week, 538 just put out a really cool one on the candidates running who are election deniers. We've done a lot of that work, but it is, we actually have a whole data team and like it's hard work to do. So, you know, kudos to you for being interested in chasing it down. You know, happy to put you in touch with more resources after this for sure.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Hi there. My name is Rachel, and I'm a reporter with STAT.
Hi, Rachel.
And so I think the way that this conversation is kind of like bubbled up in our kind of coverage area in healthcare is asking about kind of the corporate accountability side of things, because I think there was a lot of conversation kind of early 2021 about what, you know, accountability funders of these candidates have. And I think like there's kind of been a collective like forgetfulness about that conversation. So I just wanted to ask, like, obviously there's direct accountability for candidates who are talking about this, but there's also like that system that enables, like you were talking about, all those House, you know, members who voted not to certify. So I just wanted to ask kind of how you're thinking about that, like those second order kind of effects.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, I think it's safe to say we're going around talking to business leaders and folks in the, you know, wealth community, et cetera, about all this stuff. And I agree, there was a moment there where it seemed like there was an acknowledgement of the severity of the moment that we were in. So how are we thinking about that? I mean, I think broadly, the way we think about this stuff is you know, we have gotten like a ton of education over the last 5 years about this, that, you know, we're privileged enough to spend time and our work thinking about. And so when we do, you know, when we do briefings, when we host specific, when we do outreach, we think of it more as like a brain dump to empower folks to like walk the walk on this stuff. And so, you know, what I'm saying is we want, I think that we've seen, like, when folks are empowered with this information, their perspective changed and they're motivated to act. And so as an advocacy group or as a nonpartisan, you know, educational organization, that's one way that we can do it. And thinking about the second part of your question about like the accountability around, was it around like financial mechanisms specifically?
Yeah, specifically like campaign giving, like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money in kind of our industry, and I think there's been a lot of pushback on us for suggesting any kind of like accountability should be, for industry, and they're like, we're just supporting candidates who support our specific, very narrow interests, and we're not like anything else they do. It doesn't affect us, or it isn't our problem.
Totally. I think there are folks out there, including you all, who are doing excellent work, who have made their newsroom's sole agenda on providing accountability on that stuff. We're not tracking that stuff as closely. We kind of have tried to fill a lane in the good government accountability space of the authoritarian threat specifically. So there are a lot of great organizations tracking that stuff too, and outlets covering that. Where what I mentioned in terms of the disinformation stuff is there's an interesting legal approach through like defamation, where these misinformation generators who are profiting off this can be shut down through like some kind of novel defamation approaches, and so that's like the lane that we're trying to fill, and so I think trying to think about it through the framework. If you can, the more that you can frame the stuff through like, well, this is a real threat, we should be talking about it, and having the context to like have those internal conversations, I think the better.
Hello, Matt Brown, Washington Post.
Hi, Matt.
Hello. Many questions, but one right now. How do you all think about populism at Protect Democracy versus authoritarianism? I know that there's a lot of like, not conflation, but there's a lot going on in this country right now at like the very like local level and the national level. And how do you all, when you think about threats to democracy, think about disaggregating kind of, general discontent or democracy is just not working that well, populism as a phenomenon versus genuine authoritarian threats, and how do you all identify those or think about that broadly?
Yeah. Well, first, how would you distinguish between populism and authoritarianism, given all this cool new framework stuff that we've been talking about? I think I'll go back to the framework and say, the experts would say, these things are happening. Are these tactics being used? Is it a significant risk? Is the system respond to constrain it? I think you can call it authoritarianism in those cases. Now, what you're I think what you're saying is, okay, great. But if those policies are shared, or if those policy premises are shared by like a majority of the country, what does that mean for democracy? Is that right?
Well, I mean, kind of. Also, though, when you think about, a big part of populism is believing that, the people in the system must overcome some system or some establishment that's illegitimate and entrenched and against their interests. And if that is that a phenomenon that inevitably leads to authoritarianism in your view? Is that a phenomenon that can be pro-democratic, or there could be strains of it? Because I feel like a lot of questions around authoritarianism right now, and like as you were saying, like you look at people abroad, like an Erdogan or a Maduro, like they came to power because of very populist movements that then put them in place, and then they started dismantling democracy. Is populism inherently unstable to democratic systems, or is it something that, and this is also something that can go at the state level, the local level, or the federal level? Like obviously Trump is the biggest sign here in the U.S., but you can have a populist governor who starts doing the same stuff. But is that governor inherently a threat to democracy? Yeah,
totally. I think it's a super hard, very, very, very good question. Some folks, I think, in a recent paper came out maybe this summer, that argued that the conditions for authoritarian takeover in some of these countries were supported by exactly that. Or was supported by a majority group pushing this popular leader into power, and that because that hasn't necessarily been the case yet here in the U.S., like we don't have anything to worry about. I think you can look at Brazil as maybe a counter to that argument. Doesn't have the majority support of the people, is looking like it's willing to do plenty of damage on perhaps his way out of being voted out of office, and you've certainly seen the damage that can happen here. And so I think that what the way we've been thinking about it is on two fronts. First, accountability, and second, like electoral reform. So ways you can counter this stuff, both of those things. First, and I talked about this a little bit in relation to the January 6th stuff. We pressed very early on, right after the election, that there's a bunch of research based on situations around the globe that after an autocrat has been pushed out, after a dictator has been pushed out, there's a real need for accountability to prevent those things from happening again. And so that we made that, I think that's what the January 6th committee is predicated upon, that there has to be some sort of accountability for this stuff, or you see it happen again. And so I would say part of your job is helping and sort of ensure that accountability, telling the facts as they are. And second, you see in our system specifically, because right wing and extremists on the left wing, this stuff isn't just happening in the U.S., right? Like you're seeing these pockets of authoritarian leaning groups crop up in Germany and Netherlands, France, etc. But they aren't gaining, the same amount of traction because their electoral systems are different. You can kind of cabin them in a different way. We put out a paper on this too that you guys should check out, and I'll send to you. But the way our elections are set up in terms of winner takes all stuff and first past the post and the primary politics, it actually advantages authoritarian candidates because they're running to a small, they're running on policies that appeal to a smaller group of folks who are active, who are voting, and they get a nomination, and then they're, you see this extremism crop up in those ways because of our electoral system specifically. And so I think there are ways to counter this stuff through tweaks to the way that we elect our representatives that might have an impact on the populism stuff. And I'll say I don't know how that would shake out. We can't speak definitively to what more voter interest would mean either way. I think, like in Turkey, as you said, more voter engagement led actually to a more authoritarian-leaning executive, right? And so it's hard to say, but I think accountability and thinking about the way our electoral system is set up are two ways to answer that question.
Can I ask another?
It's a good question. No, it's a good question, and a lot of people I work with would love to answer that. I think. Oh, sure, yeah. I think that's one way to approach it that's better than what we're doing. I don't know if we have an official position on ranked choice voting, but we have even recently engaged fusion voting, which I will claim not to be an expert on. I was on parental leave the last several months, and we just filed this stuff. So I want to give you more on this, but I think the basic idea is that you allow, it's basically like an open primary system where you don't have just Republican voters voting for Republican candidates, and you don't just have Democratic voters voting for Democratic candidates, but allowing both primary voters, all primary voters to vote for the cadre of candidates that are out there actually moderates a lot of this stuff. And so that's one way that we've been focusing on. And I want to give you more of our stuff on the electoral reform question, which I'll be honest, I'm not an expert on, but there's some good thinking out there for sure. Go for it.
Just quickly, you guys put out a lot of papers. You do a lot of advocacy, especially at the federal level. And I know that you guys have specific policy recommendations and legal laws that you would like to see passed at the federal level to.
Thank you for plugging those.
Yeah. To curtail authoritarianism in XYZ ways. Do you have similar recommendations for what states should be doing? I know we just discussed the voting rights package at the federal level. Do you have specific things that this XYZ state should be passing these things to curtail their governors or curtail their state legislatures or make sure that their judiciaries are XYZ way or that civic culture is XYZ? Do you have any? I don't know.
Yeah. And as I said to Mark, I think that stuff has been super targeted at this point. We're relatively small, and so we're jumping in when the moment calls for it. I don't think we have a comprehensive approach to all states yet, but let's be in touch, and I can put you in touch with the Georgia folks, and we definitely have a POV on that stuff from time to time. Point of view.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, Ben.
Do you have any thoughts about the covering the independent state legislature theory in the Supreme Court case? Like, I just thought of it while we were talking. I have a colleague who the other day was actually like trying to figure out, different ways to tell that story visually, just working for ABC. Just any thought you have on that and how it ties to just some of what you study, because it does sort of come from a gerrymandering case.
Totally, exactly. We've got a couple of experts working on this stuff. I think we filed a friend of the court brief in that case, and Helen White is one. I could put you in touch with her. She has put out, I think, like the go-to explainer on this a couple months ago in Just Security, before we were all learning about what that meant. I'll say again, I'm not the expert, but we've got folks to talk to for sure.